The Lord be with you. Let us pray. Almighty and ever-living God, ruler of all things in heaven and earth, hear our prayers for this parish family of St. Peter's. Strengthen the faithful, arouse the careless, and restore the penitent. Grant us all things necessary for our common life and bring us all to be of one heart and mind within your holy church, through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Good morning. I welcome you to this annual meeting of St. Peter's Episcopal Church, and I invite you, well, I was going to invite you to stand, but many of you are still eating, but I did want to invite you to just join in as we sing together the first two verses of Christ is Made the Sure Foundation. Christ is made the sure foundation, Christ the head and cornerstone, chosen of the Lord and precious, binding all the church in one. Holy Zion's held forever, and her confidence alone. All the dedicated city, dearly loved of God on high, in exultant jubilation pours perpetual melody. God the one in three adoring, glad hymns eternally. I want to call our meeting to order and again welcome those of you who may have just come in to the annual meeting of St. Peter's Episcopal Church. It's good to see all of you here and wonderful to be able to be together in this way to hear more about the work and ministry of our parish. As we begin, I want to introduce the two people who will be serving in two roles today. Jane Gilbert is up front, is serving as our secretary today, and Tim Nolker, who serves as our parish council here at St. Peter's, is our parliamentarian. So thank you, Jane and Tim, very much. As per the bylaws of St. Peter's Church, it is incumbent upon me to announce that the polls are open, and those will remain open until we get to the end of our meeting today. At this time, I would accept a motion that we approve the minutes from the last annual meeting, which took place on February the 6th of 2022. And if you can just make sure that for Jane's purposes that we know who made that motion. Kit Baker, all right. Is there a second? Second, Jim Johnson. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. And any opposed? Thank you very much. At this time, I'm going to call on Claire O'Brien, who has served as our junior warden this year, to make the report of the nominating committee. And as she comes forward, I just want to thank Claire and the others that she will identify in just a moment for the time and effort that they spent into encouraging people to stand for nomination to serve as members of our vestry and as delegates to the annual diocesan convention. Claire.
Thank you, David. And as David said, we are very, very excited about our next group of nominees. The nominees for service on the vestry are Peter Baumgartner, Moki Carmichael, Rich Huck, Logan O'Connor, and Tracy Scooty. And these terms will expire in 2026. And the diocesan delegates are Tim Nolker for delegate, Katie Claggett for alternate, alternate delegate, and Carly Claggett.
Their
for
picture, their
alternate
pictures.
delegate.
We're gonna have pictures of them. Go forward. Go forward. Okay, back up. Yeah. If the nominees for vestry are here, if you'll please stand. Thank you very much. And also, Tim, who's already been identified as our parliamentarian today, Tim Loker, will be our delegate to Goss's Convention. And I don't know that I've seen Charlie and Katie, but Charlie and Katie Claggett are going to serve as alternates. So again, thanks to those of you who are willing to serve our church in this way, and very grateful to Claire. And the nominating committee is made up of the two wardens, the senior and junior warden, and then the previous senior warden, and then the outgoing members of our vestry. Louise Jones has served faithfully and very effectively this last year as our senior warden. But Louise was unable to be here today because she's traveling, and so Claire is going to come back up and give you a little bit of a summation of Louise's report.
So Louise Jones did a fantastic job leading us through a time of transition, but also
Just go back to the agenda.
Our church is blessed and renewed with our wonderful new rector, David Hodges, and his wife Lisa. David and Lisa have 3 adult children, Burton, Mary Catherine, and Philip, who are all just delightful. Many of you may have seen Mary Catherine helping out with the Christmas pageant most recently. And
Is that microphone on?
wonderful, fantastic family.
She's not close.
We started this year by hosting 5 meaningful conversations and with David's installation and renewal of ministry. Many parishioners found joy in sharing fellowship and faith in person following COVID limitations. Our Lenten theme this year, Life Together, offered many opportunities for parishioners to participate in Lent Madness, a Lenten book study, a Lenten quiet morning, a Shrove Tuesday, drive-through pancake supper, and many more. With mixed emotions, we said goodbye to Kelly Carlson at the end of June after she served our parish for almost 14 years. Kelly faithfully carried out her ministry as priest and pastor, and we celebrated her ministry on June 28th with Jim Purdy and Luke Jernigan, who partook in farewell services. In Louise's report, in which you'll hear more of from our treasurer soon, Louise and the entire vestry are asking you to prayerfully consider your 2023 pledge. So it is your financial gifts that allow us to open the church every day, pay our staff, support ongoing outreach, provide children and youth programs, deliver spectacular music offerings, and make continued investments in the St. Louis community. I'll sign off by relaying Louise's gratitude in serving as your senior warden and the vestry's gratitude for Louise's incredible service. And at this point, I'll hand it over to the next person. Thank you, David.
Claire, thank you very much. Before you hear from our our very new treasurer, Peter Baumgarten, who's also a nominee for the vestry, I want to take just a moment to ask you to join me in thanking Drew Gulick. Drew, would you please stand up? Drew served for maybe a little over 3 years as treasurer. And in the transition, as he's transitioned out of that role and as Peter has moved into it, Drew graciously offered to stay on as assistant treasurer. I kind of twisted Drew's arm a little bit when I first came to stay on for another year, and he was very willing to do that. And I'm grateful to him. I'm grateful for his effort, his insights, and for his diligence to helping us to be good stewards of our finances. And so, Drew, again, thank you so much for what you have done. And now it's my privilege to introduce to you Peter Baumgarten, who agreed to serve as treasurer before he was nominated to be on the vestry. So Peter has done has made an impact and is doing a very nice job. And so I'll let Peter take over and explain to you what I think has been a very diligent and effective process of putting together a budget, that your vestry has met several times to consider and to talk about and to prayerfully put forward today at this annual meeting. Peter?
Good morning, everyone. Good to see you all. So just so you all know, I'm a professor, so I'm used to speaking in about 90 minutes or 3-hour chunks of time.
Hi.
Transparency and understanding of the church financial structure before we actually get into the budget itself. Drew was incredibly gracious with his time and has continued to be gracious, as I sent him text messages at 9:30 last night, to be able to start to play out the different pieces in place for the church. And for many of us, myself included, when you come into the congregation, it's hard to know how these things all fit together. And so I want to start by just giving kind of a quick overview on how these things are tied together structurally, so you understand it, and then secondarily to follow it up with just some particular points about the budget and how they all fit together. So first thing to think about is we really have kind of 3 different high-level categories. On the right-hand side, you have annual contributions, which I'll show you kind of 2 different forms. On the left-hand side, you have a series of endowment funds, and then all of that kind of funnels into what we think of as being kind of our operating fund and any level of cash reserves. So again, just to give you a sense on how these things fit together, I think this will help us understand where the budget comes from as well. All right, so first piece of it is when it comes to annual contributions, about 92% of that amount comes from our pledged amount, which was a good reminder for me because when I first came here, my wife Kelly and I moved here in 2018. I wasn't in this bucket. I was in the next one down, kind of the unexpected plate contributions or things that come at the end of the year. But to be able to plan ahead for how we think about our spend for a given year, it's incredibly helpful for you all to be proactive in that giving amount, to be able to say, here's what I intend to give for the church. The behavioral economist in me also knows that as soon as we commit to things, we're also more likely to do it versus you hit the end of the year and all of a sudden those Christmas gifts for your nephews and nieces ended up being more expensive than you expected. But broadly, annual pledges making a good portion of that, and then plate and other contributions making a small percentage. All right, so we think of that as the annual. All of that funnels into kind of this operating fund, the amount that we'd spend in a given year. One more click through on this. And what you'll see here in a second is about 80% of our spend in a given year comes from that bucket. Right, so 80% of it is coming from stuff that you all pledge and or give in a given Sunday, as well as other unexpected gifts that come up along the way. Now, what's interesting about St. Peter's, not all churches function like this. This is me putting on my Washington University hat and thinking of endowments now, is we have a series of endowments that are specified for certain kinds of use. So what you see is a general fund. This is the biggest fund that we have from an endowment standpoint. It's been growing over time with the exception of this year where it shrinks by virtue of the market. And then a couple other ones that are there. So just to name a few of them, many of you are aware of this, but again, just to give you some structure on it, there's a columbarium fund, which allows me to walk past the columbarium with my son Fitz every morning and see a beautiful space. There's a general operations fund, a fund specific for music and ministries, a lecture series fund, as well as something really around capital improvements and other ministries. Now, one more click through. There are rules about how we can spend this. So when we think about how we be fiscally responsible with the church, we can't dip into the general fund and say, let's pull 10% this year because we have a bunch of other priorities. And in fact, as you'll see in a short bit, the last couple of years, we've been pulling a slightly higher chunk of that, more at the upper end of that range, 5%, as we've been in a pretty unusual time the last few years. And so as you'll see here in a short bit, we pulled that down to 3% a bit later on to make sure that we're being responsible with the funds. And then again, some of these other ones are a little bit different. It might be just pulling interest or dividends. Other ones don't have a specific pull tied to them. But all that capital here on the left also then goes into the operating fund of the church. All right. So you can think of this as being about 15% or so of our expenses come from that bucket, at least this year with our budget. Now, those of you doing math at home, you'll start to add this up a little bit. You're 15% plus 78%, and you realize that doesn't add up to 100%. And so what I want to highlight here is in a given year, our expenses, which most of it is staff, our expenses come to that middle area, right? That church annual expenses. And in a great year, imagine there's a lot of generosity from the church, or perhaps there's ways to be efficient in our spend or something. We might have, one more click. Don't you love having to do 17 clicks on the slide? We might have opportunities to add to a cash reserve, right? So imagine if you remember those old cell phone commercials when they talked about rollover minutes, right? So rollover funding. There might be times where we have essentially some that we push into the cash reserves for a given year. And then, I promise you, last click. Maybe second to last click. There are other times when our expenses exceed that amount that's coming in which case we have to draw down upon excess capital in that fund. So high level, this is what we have in terms of how the structure of the church is set up. And again, Drew, thank you for giving me a sense of how these things all fill out today. First piece of it, obviously, is on the annual contribution side. I hope that one of your takeaways is, I should give to St. Peter's in a more robust way. We have other things there, but they're somewhat specified, and there are rules around how we spend it. And then in a given year, we attempt to reach a level of balanced budget. If we're essentially lower in expenses, we just roll that over to the next year. If we're higher, there might be times to be able to draw down. Now, I bring this up because when we first started looking at the budget, in the first specification, it was like, Peter, welcome to being treasurer. By the way, we have a $270,000 gap that we need to figure out. And so we had to think about what are the levers that we can move in a given year to be fiscally responsible with the church's capital, not just for a single year, but also over a long period of time. That's really the vestry's job. And so we spent a lot of time going back and forth with the budget committee, with the vestry, Drew and myself going back and forth with our team that handles the finances on the church side, to be able to say, what can we do to make sure that we're setting the church up for the right position moving forward? And so what you see there is the budget that we landed on. I want to kind of go through that and flag a couple points of note that I think will be helpful for us to see before opening up to questions. All the hard ones will be directed towards Drew. I will take all the easy ones. All right, so next slide. So I just want to break it into two categories. The first one is on the revenue side, the capital coming in. I'll flag things that are maybe a little bit different than past years, just so you see kind of where we landed on this. So the first one, click, is that when you see the budget for this amount, the team does a really good job of giving us what they think of as being reliable estimates for what we can expect in terms of contribution. Now, I hope you blow this out of the water. Right, I hope you say this, let's double it, let's triple it, because it will help us. But nonetheless, we don't want to do something that I think would be fiscally irresponsible, which is to see expenses go up and then just to balance the budget by matching the revenue line with the cost line. So we came initially with a number of around $1 million expected for annual contributions based on families that have left or based on people who have passed away, amongst other things. And then we inflated that a little bit, but in, I think, a somewhat conservative way, saying that my call to you would be saying, can you consider maybe a 5% increase in this next year about what you've pledged in the past in order to meet that? Now, some of that 5% increase might come from people like my own family that gave in the past more in terms of plate that are moving now over towards something in the annual contributions. But we wanted to be conservative and yet somewhat aspirational when it comes to this number. So the conservative piece is the $1 million. The aspirational is saying, what about a 5% increase on this based on you all seeing the need of the church moving forward? All right, second point. Very small point here, but you'll see this new line that wasn't in the past, event sponsorship, that we flagged. One of the things that we realized is that there's some events that are really, really helpful for the church and the community that actually might be something that could be individually funded. So, for example, a food truck Sunday, right? Things to kind of pull people together. That to the extent that people get really excited about that or other particular lines the church is doing, that there could be ways to pull that out and get sponsorship. It also gives us an opportunity to say, let's find some alternative ways to raise capital by earmarking things for things that matter. All right, next one. So this point you might be looking at and saying, why did we go from 191 to 131? For those of you that have been depressingly tracking your retirement accounts, there's a couple reasons behind this. One is tied towards market performance. So the market is down this year, and so our 3-year average pull of this would be naturally down. But that won't get you that entire $60,000 gap. The other piece of it is the last several years, we've been pulling at a 5% clip. So remember back to that previous slide, 3 to 5% range. We've been pulling probably too much, within range, but too much to be able to sustain that over time. And so last year, Drew, in meeting with the endowments committee, said, we promise you to go back down to the mid to low end of that range for our particular pull. Knowing that if you always pull at the top end, you start to be irresponsible with that pull. So pulled back to it. Luckily, we had some excess from the last year that rolled over. So it ends up being a little bit higher, but in general, it's saying we're thinking of kind of drawing down that number. So this is in part why there's this gap that we came up with. We have some sort of gap on the revenue side that fills over to how we have to think about the cost side. Apologies for my computer needing update on the bottom. No, you're good. You're good. All right, so let's go to the next one. I'm going to break the church cost structure into two different categories. One is the operating expenses tied towards admin and staff. You'll notice pretty quickly that we are staff-driven, right? So in other words, you look at this, a lot of our cost, right? Last year, the actual amount spent, 973 out of a budget of 1.4, 1.5. That's 60 to 70% or so comes from the people. Very common for churches in that way. The people are a large part of what we're doing in terms of the work. That's also something that we don't have as much flexibility to move down, right? Let's get rid of people or let's cut salaries by 25%. Those aren't things that we would ever do. Now, there are some quote-unquote efficiencies found there, and in large part it's tied towards roles that are combined. So as we've had shifts of different people who have left the staff particular role or clergy specific role, saying, are there ways to be able to combine together different things that have been done in the past by two people that could be done by one person or something like that. So not major changes there, but we'll go to the next clip. So some savings as a result of just change in turnover on staff that allows us to think flexibly about how we want to staff up to the church approach. We'll go to the next one. You'll notice here an important point, another new line around strategic planning. So part of David coming on board and thinking about what the church is going to look like moving forward, financially is just one piece of it, but the vision for how we do ministry is to engage an external partner in this work to be able to give insights around how to think about this work. And so we had a gracious gift that I'll talk about here in a second from a couple years back that we were able to pull pieces of that forward to be able to fund a strategic planning effort that will engage you all in a process around the future of the church. All right, last slide, I promise you. On the expenses side, a few things to note here. So when you start out with $277,000 of gap, you have to start to think about how do you reduce costs, but in ways that you think are mission aligned with the work itself. And so one number that you'll notice that is down a bit is on the music side. I will say one of the things that we attempted to do, you can click through in this one, is really to think critically about our spend on the music side to engage David in this process, both Davids in this process, but also to do so in ways that don't impact personnel and really, in our view, don't really impact the parishioner experience in a significant way. And so you don't see this line item here, but this is actually a number that aligns our spend more with what it was pre-pandemic, 2019. This was a hard area to be able to think through. I'm the son of a person who led music at our church growing up, a Presbyterian church, I'll say. So this is a big part of why we came to St. Peter's. We love the music and the music experience here. And yet it's also one of the largest kind of line items for us as a church. And so we were trying to find ways to be fiscally responsible on how we thought about spend. We engaged David in that process to be able to do so in ways that, again, we think don't impact people, don't impact congregational experience as much as it could, and kind of a return to 2019 numbers there. I also notice here too, or I'll note here, so music ministry is one of those things that we're deeply passionate about. And so there could be ways that there are ways to do special offerings or special gifts as we have that extra category for people that feel deeply passionate about this line. There also is a music endowment fund that we pull from to fund parts of the music program. So as you think about things that you might want to do to drive sustainability for music at St. Peter's moving forward. That might be something that you think about in terms of your own philanthropic priorities. Now, with that said, I want to just note here at the end, you'll notice that we're proposing something that's an unbalanced budget. And I wanted to show you that first slide there because the unbalanced budget, there are times in which, again, if you're overspending, we went through every single line item and tried to find ways to be, again, responsible about this. We still ended up with more expenses than we had revenue coming in. Now, there's ways that we can do this. So a couple things that I'll highlight. One piece is, I hope, a call to action of people in this room saying we want to make sure that we have St. Peter's be set up for being a fiscally responsible congregation moving forward. And so as you think about your own priorities of giving in the next year, perhaps you say maybe not a 5%, but a 6% or 7% increase of how I want to spend. The second thing that I'll note here is that we do believe that the strategic planning efforts will help us think creatively about the use of this campus and the ways to engage people in a more holistic way that do drive increases of revenue moving forward. And then the final thing that I'll notice is you might look at this and say, oh no, are we going to have to write a $100,000 check at the end of the year? As you'll notice in the past, when there are times in which we're over, we can pay out of cash reserves. And so there are cash reserves. So when we look at this, we don't look at something that's leaving the church in a perilous state. But we had a very generous gift in 2019 that we've essentially kind of earmarked pieces of that gift to be able to fund the gap at the end of the year. Now, one of the things that I'll encourage the vestry to think about moving forward is we want to make sure that we don't overly rely on gifts like that, right? So you don't want to go and every single year propose a budget that has a gap. But I do think that as we're returning back to a bit more of a normal cadence, great to have a full room here, for example, and a more full congregational experience moving forward, we can start to think strategically about how we set ourselves up as a church and use the gift of that gift to give us a bit more flexibility for this year as we rethink our approach. So again, one of the things that Drew and I did while engaging a bunch of other people was to think conservatively when it comes to the revenue, to think creatively when it came to the cost, to make sure that we're doing St. Peter's in the way that are mission aligned, and then also to rely for a period of time on generosity from someone back in 2019 that gives us some space to be able to roll forward with moving forward. So again, some benefit of a excess contribution last year that covers that, some benefit of a 2019 gift, but that's where we landed in terms of process. I told you that I'm used to talking for 3 hours. This is as short as I could go. But I do want to open it up for questions for Drew and myself as need be. Please.
I had two questions. Are we paying the full diocesan assessment?
Yeah, so on the assessment here, this is a tricky item. So for those of you that are not aware of this, there is about a 10% charge that we pay to the diocese on this assessment amount. That's based on previous years or 2 years back gift. So St. Peter's has always paid the full amount of that amount. Or maybe not always. Okay, good. You all have I'm a 2020 guy, so I'm a new guy. For the last several years, we've paid that full amount. Now, the amount that was requested this year was inflated quite a bit by about $40,000, $50,000, in part tied towards the fact that we were being assessed on a 2-year moving back number, and that 2-year back number was one that included PPP money. And so as we thought through this, we meaning the vestry, I'm not officially on it yet, but maybe by the end of the meeting, we thought that we could maintain the strategy of paying the full amount, but we felt that the requested amount, given that it was pulling on the PPP money, which the Episcopal Church also received, because they're also a nonprofit in this space, was kind of double dipping to some degree. And so that was one element of the cost savings, goal of maintaining this priority around paying that amount, which some of the congregations in the region, the diocese, don't, but seemed to be a priority for the vestry as well as for our leadership. And yet at the same point said, this doesn't feel like a fair extra ask. So that was one of the first lines that we came to give us about $50,000 or $60,000 of savings.
Then I apologize for having a second question, but
Yeah.
I remember back, and maybe I'm wrong, but when we had that gift, there was some talk about looking again at physical accessibility, especially for conversation go away, or is that still in the background, or is that a Drew question?
Yeah, so I've just heard pieces of this story, so maybe Drew, you can speak to this one. I told you all the tough ones are coming towards Drew at this point, but he was involved in those conversations before I came on board.
So that is something. Oh.
Please.
So the physical accessibility to this space was something that I think took a lot of vestry attention and deliberation. Probably I would say about a year ago. And so we looked at different options for ways to increase the accessibility down here, and really kind of came up with two options. One would be to install like a wheelchair, like a lift out here, and the other was a ramp. Both of these are incredibly expensive options, and we just looked at that on balance with what we're facing with fiscally that Peter was just going through, along with the fact that we do have an elevator that allows access to this space, and just said at this point in time, that's probably not one of our top investment priorities, but it is something that we're going to continue to consider.
I saw a hand somewhere in this category. Yes, please.
So, what is going to change in the music program with this reduction?
Yeah, so I can look at the exact notes, and David, maybe you can speak briefly to this point, but what we were looking at was kind of a higher reduction of music expenses and then a lower, two categories of reduction. We went with the lower amount of the two. We engaged David on what would be the best way to do it, because it wouldn't make sense for me or for any of us to say, hey, we don't need this spend on music X, or you don't need to do the organ stuff. But what we asked was to do a reduction that prioritized people, meaning to make sure that we retain the paid choir. A big portion of the spend is the paid choir, if you break that down. So I think there were some reductions around new music purchase in a given year. We went actually to a couple other churches and found out some of what they've done. So some churches do an approach where they do kind of music purchase every 3 years to be able to reduce that. That was one. I'm trying to think. Evensong reduction, or in terms of total number of evensongs, was a piece that was involved in that recommendation. I'd have to look at the exact pieces of that story. But again, we asked for a higher percentage pull and a lower percentage pull. We landed on the lower percentage pull with a prioritization around not impacting the people, as well as a traditional Sunday experience at the church itself. Yes, please.
Are we still paying back the loan that we had through the diocese with the reconstruction that we did a few years ago?
Drew, why don't you speak to the loan structure piece as well? Because I think you'll have the best insight in that one.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a really good question. Folks might remember that when we did the construction down here and in the Elliott room and then the windows, there were some parishioners who said, I'd like to make a gift towards that over time. And so to be able to do that work right away, we took out a loan from the diocese. It was called the White Fund loan. And so we were paying that off over time. And so this year we did finish paying that off. So we no longer have an outstanding balance there.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for the time. Again, it really was a group effort. There were a series of meetings, both with vestry, with the committee, with Drew and myself, with the staff, in order to get there. Our hope in the midst of this is to, again, call to your attention the need to be able to be invested in this congregation, emotionally, fiscally, et cetera, and also at the same point to make sure that we're doing things and recommending things to the vestry that leave us in a good spot as a congregation moving forward. If you have any other questions, feel free to grab me. I'm typically with my wife, who's 8.75 months pregnant. We're due next week, and our son Fitz, who, if you've been at the 10:30 service, you'll hear screams at different points at the very tail end. Yeah.
I'd just like to make a statement. I'm Francis Gay with St. Peter's Cares, and this is not included in the budget, but there are many parishioners here who give a lot of their own to the outreach in this program in St. Peter's Cares. That's not computed in this, but I think should be recognized and say thank you to all of you who give so generously.
Maybe not everybody knows.
not many people knew what St. Peter's Cares is, but there is an article in the annual report about what St. Peter's Cares does. Thank you.
Thank you. And Peter, thank you again very much for all your work and effort, and also Drew. I want to just ask for a motion to affirm the work that our finance committee has done and that the vestry has approved for moving forward with the budget for this year.
So moved.
Brigg? And a second? Jim Johnson. All in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Thank you. Thank you very much. So the only people who talk longer than professors are priests. So I'm going to join Peter in trying to move this along just a little bit. But I just want to take a few minutes to talk a little bit about our church and about some things that I see that we have been doing together, and a little bit of a look into the future. As I had begun my second year as your rector, I just want to tell you how grateful I am for each of you and for the many ways in which we're working together to carry out the ministry of Jesus Christ here at St. Peter's. During this last year, we've been able to move beyond the various restrictions and limitations that had necessarily been placed on worship and on our ability to come together in this way and in a variety of ways for fellowship, for food, and for Christian formation. During this last year, people have returned to church. We've had people visit our church. Our attendance has increased. Our children and youth ministries programs have been re-energized, and we've been able to resume ways of doing and being that all of us, I think, in some ways missed over the last couple of years. At the same time, it's become apparent that some of what had been will no longer be. Our church, along with every church in the Episcopal Diocese of Missouri and churches everywhere, were forced because of the pandemic to adapt in order to be able to continue our ministry. But despite the challenges, the restrictions, and the changes, we moved forward. And we've done that with what I believe is a real and valid sense of hope and optimism about the future of this great church. One of the things that I have an opportunity to do on a daily and weekly basis is work with a very fine group of people who give of themselves in a number of ways to help us carry out the work that we do at St. Peter's. And some of the members of our lay staff are here this morning, and I want to ask you to join me in thanking them for what they do as I introduce them to you. And some of you may be meeting some of them for the first time because a few of them are new. As I call your name, if you'll just come down here with me, please. Janet Rouse is our Director of Stewardship and Parish Life. David Sinden, who is ill, is not able to be here today, but he, as you know, is our Director of Music and our organist. Darcy Brainerd, who is one of the newer members of our staff, is our Parish Administrator. Jacqueline Van Welden, who has served as our Director of Communications, has recently taken a new position, but is continuing to help, especially on Sundays. Regina Edwards is our sexton. I would invite you to hold Regina and her family in your prayers. Regina returned last night from San Antonio, where she had to go earlier in the week. Unfortunately, very unfortunately, her daughter and her brother were involved in a very serious automobile accident in which her brother was killed, and her daughter was seriously injured. So just again, invite you to hold that family up in your prayers during a difficult time. Lisa Reynolds, who I don't believe is here today, is the director of the St. Peter's Playgroup. Christina Koch is another relatively new member of our staff, and she is our administrative assistant. Yvonne Twillman is our director of Children and Family Ministries. And Zach Rugenstone is our youth minister, and Zach is over hanging out with young people right now. So, again, I just want to thank them for what they do, and hope that you will, again, as you have today, continue to thank them. Did I leave somebody out? You're pointing. I'm going to get to that. Yeah, just hold on. Just hold on. And I also do want to thank my clergy colleagues who have very ably been our assisting clergy during the time that since Kelly Carlson left last summer. Nathan Hayden, who is here this morning. Nathan. And then Susie Skinner, Luke Jernigan, and Jay Kanzler. It's been a gift. It's been a gift to have them be part of our clergy ministry here during this time. I also want to recognize and thank our vestry, who have done and who continue to very faithfully carry out the ministry, which is what it is, the ministry that they're called to for a 3-year period of time. So I'd like to just invite our current vestry, if you would please stand. And then I want to say a special word of thanks to the 4 who are retiring. And they are Lisa Acker, would you please come down? Louise Jones, who, as you know, has been our senior warden, but is not able to be here today. Mike Newport. Mike, if you would come down. And then also Julie Peters, who I don't believe I've seen today. Lisa and Mike. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mike.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Annual meetings are time to hear about the life and the work that all of us are called to in this holy place. And as I mentioned in my sermon today, the call of God is something that always takes us into an uncertain future in which we don't always know where we're going to end up. But every day and in a variety of ways, some that are at times are very clear and some that are often very difficult to discern, God is always calling out to people like you and me, asking us to try to find out more of who we are and to be able to identify what it is that God has created us to be. And every day, God is calling and inviting people like you and me to follow Him, to consider becoming part of something that's about more than just us. And that's exactly what this church that has now been in existence for 155 years is meant to be. It's meant to be a place where you and me and others can connect, where we can be shaped and formed, where we can worship, and where we can come to a deeper sense that we're part of something that's more than just us. So as you may know, there has been quite a bit of concern and skepticism about what would happen to the church with a capital C, to this church, to St. Michael and St. George, to First Presbyterian, whatever, in the aftermath of the pandemic that changed or altered so many things. But even before the pandemic, a lot had changed in the landscape of churches of every denomination, of every stripe and flavor, as a result of a societal trend that had begun to see decreased attendance, decreased participation, financial concerns, aging facilities, and in many, many cases, actually the closing of churches. There are currently somewhere between 6,000 and 10,000 churches in the United States that close every year. So I want to just throw a few statistics at you, not for the sake of statistics, but just because I want to share with you some things that I think are positive, and some things that I think can help us as we again have moved forward with what I believe is a sense of optimism and hope. Over 2/3 of churches now have a worship attendance of under 100 people. while only 8% of churches have an attendance of over 250. That has changed dramatically in the last decade. In what is now being referred to as the new categories of church size, any church with an attendance of over 100 is now considered to be a large church. So this church, our church, with a current average attendance of somewhere around 180, means that not only are we a large church, but we are also part of a very small percentage of churches that are our size. And not only are we a large church within our diocese, the Episcopal Diocese of Missouri, or the Episcopal Church, but we're a large church anywhere you go, okay? So as I mentioned when I began, despite the challenges and the restrictions and all of the changes, we at St. Peter's have moved forward, and we've done that in a very positive and productive way. And now, though, after years of uncertainty and these changes that have affected religious life across our country, what we're beginning to see are some signs of hope. And so I want to just share with you again a few other things, and this comes from an organization called the Barna Group. You can keep going. Well, the Barna Group conducts research and has conducted research for years on faith and culture. And their most recent study is titled Rising Spiritual Openness in America. And what it reveals is that 3 out of 4 people are now saying that they want to have a spiritual dimension to their life. And almost half, 44%, say that they're more open to God today than they were before the pandemic. So 3 out of 4 people say, I want something, and then almost half say that they're more open to God today. So even as religious affiliation and as church attendance continue to decline, spiritual openness and curiosity are rising. And across every generation, there's an unprecedented desire to grow spiritually and to believe in God or in a higher power. And so in a culture that has now relegated Sunday worship and other church-related activities to the sidelines and just kind of push them out of the way, what this study and others are showing is that across every demographic, but especially with teenagers, there remains a refreshingly open receptivity to Jesus. And the study concludes with this: the challenge facing the church is whether we are ready and able to meet the spiritually open, where they are and as they are. So during this time that I've been part of St. Peter's, I have felt and seen the movement and the power of God's life-giving Spirit at work in this place. In my report, that's part of this annual report that I hope you picked up a copy of and you'll take with you, I mentioned something that Richard Rohr talks about when he says you can experience a church in the true and deepest meaning of the term when you gather in love with your neighborhood, with your friends, and with your family. And so in this time, and when we're beginning to see and to hear that people are opening up to what it means to have a relationship with God, we have a lot to offer. We have a lot to offer, and we're well positioned to look for more ways to try to reach out to and be responsive and receptive to these people who are now saying that they're spiritually open, and to meet them where they are and as they are. I'm excited about that because I think it is filled with opportunity and it's filled with possibility. We have some work to do that will involve all of us listening to each other, and most of all, listening to God and trying to discern what it is that God is calling us to do right now. And then finding ways to implement that and to carry it out. But as we do that, I hope that we'll remember that the call of God is always something that takes us into an uncertain future. We have no idea where it all may end up, but what we can know is that God is already ahead of us. God is already out there, asking you and me to follow. God bless you. God keep you. And again, I am grateful for you and for the work and ministry that we do here together at St. Peter's. At this time, I would accept a motion that the polls close and that we approve the report of the nominating committee that Claire O'Brien made that included 5 new members of the vestry and 3 who will serve our parish as delegates to diocesan convention.
So moved.
Okay? Is there a second? Second? Penny George? All in favor? Aye. And any opposed? Thank you. Thank you for your attendance and for your participation in this, and God bless you.